And Ben Brown in the studio. BBC News at 1.
Commemorations are underway to mark the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings. The Queen was joined in Portsmouth by Theresa May, President Trump and other world leaders to remember the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France.
75 years ago, hundreds of thousands of young soldiers, sailors and airmen left these shores in the cause of freedom.
More than 300 veterans of that D-Day landing gathered to remember the sacrifices of the thousands of men and women who fought to liberate Europe.
This is it. They're on the beach.
The invasion was the largest combined land, air and naval operation in history and one of the most decisive battles of the Second World War.
I'm honoured to be stood here today in front of so many other veterans. You never forget your comrades because we're all in it together. It's right that the courage and sacrifice of so many is being honoured 75 years on. We must never forget.
Senior figures from every country that fought alongside the UK have been attending. They've agreed a commitment to uphold democracy, tolerance and the rule of law. We'll have the latest from here in Portsmouth.
And also this lunchtime, social workers are severely criticised over the brutal murders of 2 toddlers in Northamptonshire. Creditors vote on whether to accept a rescue deal for Sir Philip Green's retail group Arcadia. And women born in the 1950s take the government to court over the way their pension ages were increased.
Later on BBC London.
In the cold grey light of the 6th of June.
Honouring his lost friends, the D-Day veteran from Lewisham preparing to sing before the Queen.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1 from Portsmouth, where the Queen has led commemorations to mark the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Hundreds of veterans, now in their 90s, have been joined by world leaders of the countries which fought alongside Britain in one of the most decisive battles of the Second World War. The invasion was the largest combined land, air and naval operation in history. Duncan Kennedy has our first report on today's events to remember the sacrifices of the thousands of men and women who battled to liberate Europe from Nazi occupation.
From thousands to hundreds, the numbers of veterans may be dwindling, but the pride they take and the respect they're given is undiminished.
All over the world.
16 world leaders are here to absorb the nostalgia and pay tribute to sacrifice. 2,500 Americans were to die on D-Day, the second worst single day of losses for the United States in World War II.
Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity.
While the great armada of ships bears down on the Cherbourg Peninsula and the many...
The scale of D-Day was as breathtaking as its ambition.
There comes the grinding of keels on shingle, and our troops spill ashore across that open stretch menaced by enemy gunfire.
4,000 landing craft, 12,000 aircraft, 156,000 troops, including the Royal Marines.
When we chucked smoke bombs through the slits, they was coming out in the long johns. They'd been asleep.
Eric Carter landed at dawn, 18 years old, an unknown enemy ahead, an undaunting belief in the mission. How frightening a day was D-Day?
Well, I don't know. As I say, most of us were youngsters. He was like cowboys and Indians to us. And I can't say I was really scared, because how can you be scared when you don't know what's going to happen?
The troop landing craft was packed to full capacity. There was no cover for the army, just standing or sitting.
Britain lost around 1,500 men on D-Day. The Prime Minister reflected on that human cost by recalling a letter found on the body of a Captain Norman Skinner, written to his wife Gladys.
My darling, this is a very difficult letter for me to write. As you know, something may happen at any moment, and I cannot tell when you will receive this. I had hoped to be able to see you during last weekend, but it was impossible to get away, and all the things I intended to say must be written. I'm sure that anyone with imagination must dislike the thought of what's coming. But my fears will be more of being afraid than of what can happen to me. You and I have had some lovely years.
Those who survived the horrors of the Normandy beaches have twilighted into their 10th decade. But today, that vast arc of time was bridged with vivid memories.
It is with humility and pleasure, on behalf of the entire country, indeed the whole free world, that I say to you all, thank you.
Tributes and reflections. A moment to recall that D-Day depended on numbers, planning, luck, subterfuge and courage. A brittle collective of resolve, timing and the momentum of history. A great enterprise of liberation to help bring the evil domination of Nazism to an end. So an extraordinarily powerful, a very emotive event here today, with none of the politics that we had yesterday, just really the sheer humanity of commemoration. President Trump himself will fly off to Ireland now, but he'll be joining all the other leaders that were here today in northern France for tomorrow's main event, where we're expected to see some very moving events, Simon, on the beaches of Normandy.
Duncan, thank you very much. 300 veterans are marking the anniversary with a voyage to France on board a specially chartered cruise ship, the Boudicca. For men who are now in their 90s, it's a chance for them to reflect on their journey to the Normandy beaches and to commemorate the thousands of comrades who never returned. Our correspondent Robert Hall has been speaking to them as they gathered to remember.
Jim Grant's D-Day began on board a landing craft, lumbering through the surf towards the Normandy beaches. 75 years older, he was afloat again, guest of the Royal Marines on a wind-swept ride across Poole Harbour.
Lot faster than I thought it would be. It would have took us about 4 times as long to get round that river.
The Boudicca's arrival in Poole gave the 300 veterans and their companions a taste of what was to come on both sides of the Channel.
It makes you feel so proud and yet so humble at the same time. Oh, yeah.
You feel humble. Can you imagine how I do? I don't deserve to be here.
They are the heroes of D-Day. Just everything that we're celebrating now, as I say, just, yeah, really, really excited to be part of this. And to be with my granddad and have memories that I can keep forever.
If you've got any questions or you want to play with anything, just let me know.
On the quayside, men who'd stumbled ashore weighed down with weapons and equipment, men who'd helped supply the bridgehead, examined the tools of modern warfare.
Oh my goodness! I couldn't have run with that. Hang on.
Sit back.
The excitement among veterans was infectious. Men in their 90s scrambling to get in on the action.
You fired a gun then?
Some could not quite believe they were here.
wish to come here, but I thought, well, I've got past it, I can't do that.
It didn't think you'd be able to make another voyage to Normandy. We cannot comprehend what these ladies and gentlemen did for us to give us our freedom. We've no comprehension.
This is a really cool bag.
Not far away, curiosity of a different kind.
How did you know you went to be?
It's a humbling experience to hear what they remember so clearly, and to then remember what that did for the rest of our life, the rest of all of our lives thereafter. So they're amazing people, and it's a real privilege to meet them today.
Today, the veterans disembarked in the port where many of them boarded ships in 1944. They believe these commemorations will help them pass on the baton of remembrance.
It's very important to remember this, because if we hadn't, Hitler might have took us over, but thank goodness he didn't.
Something you'll never say again, will you? I mean, I suppose this will be the real last commemoration there'll be for this sort of thing. Because everybody's getting so old, they'll soon be all disappeared.
We've both got children, and we've now got grandchildren as well, and they're very interested, and I think it should be remembered. I think a lot of people died for where we are today.
They may be dwindling in number, but the survivors of D-Day will tell you it's their duty to be here. Robert Hall, BBC News, Southsea.
Well, with me now is General Sir Nick Carter, who's Chief of the Defence Staff. And that was a service which brought many lumps to many throats, wasn't it?
No, absolutely. It was a huge privilege to be able to watch it. And it was a huge privilege to be able to watch it in the company of so many veterans.
Why so important to commemorate D-Day?
Well, I think it was one of the most important battles that that generation lived through. It was a battle that gave us a foothold in Europe, and it was a battle that ultimately led to the defeat of the Nazi regime. So in every way, it was a decisive moment in World War II.
And what were the lessons of it, do you think?
Well, I think obviously the courage and bravery of those who took the beaches and established the beachhead. But also it was a hugely important national enterprise, because a whole load of people who put on uniform just for a very short period of time, whether they were scientists, mathematicians, or just engineers, pulled together a most remarkable plan. And there was a huge amount of ingenuity and imagination that went into the plan. It was really quite a technical set of initiatives.
I mean, obviously we have the most important people in the world here today, and yet perhaps the most important people were those 300 veterans.
I think that's exactly right. It should be all about them. And I've just been very privileged to be in the company of Her Majesty the Queen and the President of the United States of America, talking to 6 of those, 5 gentlemen and 1 lady. And it was really humbling to see how that engagement was, and how really they were on front and centre in terms of what they did.
What sort of questions were being asked?
Well, sort of what they remembered, really, because of course that's in a sense what it's all about. What they remembered, and what their fears were at the time. And of course the unifying thing you get from all of them was they didn't want to let their mates down.
General Sir Nick Carter, great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Simon.
Well, some of the aircraft used on D-Day are recreating their flight of 75 years ago. And John Maguire has been with them as they prepare to reimagine the first airborne assault troops and that trip to Normandy as the invasion got underway.
Well, Simon, we're at the Imperial War Museum at Duxford in Cambridgeshire. You can see 2 of the Dakota aircraft just parked on the runway behind me there, the C-47 Skytrains. They were absolutely central on D-Day. Many of them will have taken off actually on the 5th because they were airborne just before midnight to start dropping troops over northern France. 800 Dakotas were involved on that day. Around 22,000 men were part of that massive airborne invasion. Around 20 of these aircraft will take off this afternoon, carrying something like 200 parachutists who will recreate the events of D-Day 75 years ago. Among them, 2 veterans from the Second World War from those jumps. We've been to meet one. Let's talk to Harry Reid.
In 1944, a 20-year-old paratrooper was training for D-Day. His army paybook shows how some of his training took place at Netheravon Airfield in Wiltshire. 75 years on, and Harry Reid has returned to Netheravon and is about to return to parachuting.
It's great to meet you too.
I'm Dean, the team sergeant.
Now, as then, Harry's turned out immaculately, But these days his uniform is that of the Salvation Army, and his jump today will raise money for it. He meets his modern-day equivalents, paratroopers from the US and the UK, who will jump alongside him and who have much in common.
You had to push hard enough to miss the back of the hole so that your parachute didn't push you forward, because that banged your nose on the other side, which they called ringing the bell, by the way.
We all go through tough training, and then at the end of the day, it's our jobs to jump out of airplanes behind enemy lines, and it's something that we look back on, and we always remember they were the trailblazers.
The first men to move in on the Normandy coastline.
His thoughts at this time of year turn to those comrades who never returned from northern France, and despite his age, he was fully aware of what he was being ordered to do on that day.
I came to the conclusion, very seriously, to my own satisfaction, that I would shirk nothing. I wouldn't surrender. If I had to have my little fight with the Germans on my own, I'd do it and die. That I would be true to the traditions that had grown up around our kind of unit, and I'd pay the price if necessary.
800 Dakotas flew thousands of troops to France, and today 24 are recreating that flight. The seats here, there are 27 of them. You can just imagine this whole back of the aircraft being absolutely rammed with burly paratroopers, all of their kit, equipment, radios, weapons, ready to jump into northern France. This cable that runs the length of the fuselage is where they would have clipped on their static line to deploy the parachute once they jump out. You can imagine the adrenaline coursing through their veins as they leapt out. Destination, northern France, and the liberation of Europe.
This stops you banging your head on my helmet.
Harry will exit the same aircraft type, but will free fall, attached to one of the Red Devils display team. Airborne troops talk of a unique bond, a brotherhood, the same for these young men today as it was for the tens of thousands of young men 3/4 of a century ago.
John Maguire reporting from Duxford in Cambridgeshire there, and that recreation of that parachute drop taking place over the skies of Normandy later this afternoon. Now, attempts to predict the weather played a crucial part in the preparations for D-Day. Military planners wanted to ensure calm seas, tidal patterns and the right kind of moon, which would all work in the Allies' favour. Our weather presenter, Carol Kirkwood, has spent the morning at Southwark House, around 10 miles north of here, to see how meteorologists plotted the best time to attack.
I'm in Southwark House near Portsmouth in the actual D-Day map room with the actual D-Day map used for the launch. Now, the weather played an important role in deciding when to invade, so let's find out why.
Months and years of waiting were over.
Planning an operation as important as D-Day took months, but despite the greatest military precision, there was one thing they couldn't predict: the weather. The requirements were strict: a combination of clear skies, a full moon, calm seas and a low tide were all needed to make D-Day a success. This put enormous pressure on meteorologists to identify a suitable weather window at a time when predicting just 24 hours ahead was a challenge. The man responsible for advising General Eisenhower on the best day to launch the invasion was Group Captain James Stagg.
I had long had at the back of my mind the tactical use of weather, just to be able to pick out some little interlude which would be unknown to the enemy forces, that would allow us to make use of it and catch the people on the other side unawares.
Heading out to sea after a 24-hour delay because of the weather.
The invasion was originally planned for the 5th of June, but after Stagg predicted bad weather in the Channel, it was postponed by 24 hours. In the end, the weather on D-Day wasn't ideal. Strong winds and rough seas made for a difficult landing. But if the troops had waited for the next window, the fleet would have been battered by one of the worst summer storms to hit the English Channel in decades. As it was, the success of Stagg's forecast allowed the troops to land on the French beaches, and the tide of World War II began to turn.
Carol Kirkwood there reporting. And Ben, a moment not just to reflect here in Portsmouth and to look at the 300 veterans who have been taking part in ceremonies here, but also all the viewers at home who will be remembering parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. A very moving day ahead of another day tomorrow as we remember D-Day 75 years on. We'll have more from Portsmouth a little later, but now back to you.
Indeed, Simon. Thank you very much indeed. Serious case reviews into the brutal murder of 2 toddlers have severely criticised social workers with Northamptonshire County Council. 1-year-old Evelyn Rose Muggleton was killed by her mother's partner last year, while 2-year-old Dylan Tiffin Brown was killed by his father in 2017. The case reviews paint a picture of chaos in the Children's Services Department, with a high turnover of staff, high sickness levels and heavy caseloads. Caroline Davis reports.
2 young children, both killed at the hands of violent men. What more could have been done to save them? Today, 2 reviews were published about how different agencies in Northampton were involved before the toddlers died. Dylan Tiffin Brown was 2 years old when he was murdered by his father, Raphael Kennedy, a drug dealer. He was given a sentence of a minimum of 24 years. The report shows that 2 months before Dylan's death, police discovered the toddler in his father's care in a property with access to drugs and that he was left on his own for periods of time. The family was given a social worker, but up until his death, no observation was made of Dylan. Evelyn Rose Muggleton was 1 year old when she was admitted to hospital with bleeding on the brain. She died a few days later. Her mother's then boyfriend, Ryan Coleman, was convicted of murder and given a sentence of 17 years. Coleman also had a history of drugs abuse and dealing.
I'm not going to go through all of these.
The review found that there had been several missed opportunities where information could have been shared between different agencies, including by the police. Northamptonshire Council has struggled with its finances. This is not the first time that the children's services have been under pressure. Last month, an independent report described it as very fragile. The new director says there's still a long way to go.
Since I have been in Northampton, I have found that there are things that need to be put right and that the organisation has been endeavouring to put right for some time and is working very hard on putting things right. But there is a way to go. There are improvements, undoubtedly, but there is still a way to go with a number of the issues.
Today's reviews say that there are lessons that must be learnt so that services do what they can to stop tragic deaths like these happening again. Caroline Davis, BBC News.
Sir Philip Green's retail group Arcadia is holding a crucial meeting with its creditors as it tries to avoid administration. The company, which owns Topshop, Burton and Miss Selfridge, plans to close dozens of stores and wants to agree big rent cuts at nearly 200 others. Last night, Sir Philip agreed to put an extra £25 million into the group's pension fund. Well, our business correspondent Emma Simpson is at that meeting in central London. So, Emma, how likely is a deal to be approved?
Ben, I think there's a real element of uncertainty in all of this. Lots of retailers have done these restructuring deals and they've all passed, but this one is the most complex and contentious so far. Now, last night, as you said, Sir Philip Green got the backing of the pension regulator. That was absolutely crucial. Today, it's all down to the landlords and they'll have to accept swinging rent cuts, and they're obviously not happy, but in the end, it all comes down to individual commercial interest. Some rent might be better than no rent. We'll know the outcome later today. There's a lot riding on it because Arcadia says if this deal doesn't go through, it's likely to face administration.
Emma, thank you very much indeed. Emma Simpson. Women born in the 1950s have taken the government to the High Court over the way their pension ages were increased to bring them into line with men. The state pension age for women was raised from 60 to 65 and will soon move to 66. Campaigners argue the shift was unfair for nearly 4 million people who didn't have enough time to prepare. Well, our personal finance correspondent Simon Gompertz reports.
We're on our way to make them pay high.
Taking on the government. What's provoked this from women born in the 1950s is the equalisation of pension ages between men and women. They say the way it's being done, pushing theirs up, amounts to sex discrimination. Why is this process, in your view, sex discrimination?
Because we weren't given enough notice. And it's not about the non-equality, it's we weren't equal to start with.
We never had the opportunity to join an occupational pension scheme, for an example. We was excluded from that, so we've never been able to build up a pension pot.
Once the female pension age was 60, now it's 65 like men and 66 next year. These women are asking for a back payment of all the pension they would have picked up had they been able to get the state pension from the age of 60. But their critics say that's asking for too much, because the total bill for the taxpayer, if they got all of that, would add up to more than £70 billion.
Some jobs might be fine at 66, mine certainly isn't.
Timandra, a 64-year-old ambulance driver in Margate, had little more than a year's notice that she wouldn't be able to retire at 60, and she's still working.
I'm angry. I feel discriminated against, that I wasn't told. I think it's either due to gross incompetence of the government, or they didn't think it through and what impact it would have on the 1950s women.
The government says it decided more than 20 years ago it was going to make the pension age the same for men and women as a long overdue move towards gender equality, and this has been clearly communicated. But Timandra believes she's lost £49,000 and she wants that money back. Simon Gompertz, BBC News.
Right, let's take you back to Simon now in Portsmouth.
Ben, thank you very much. And let's get the thoughts of Robert Hall, who spent the last few days with the veterans who we've been watching today. And there's something seeing the faces of men in their 90s just light up at events like this.
Yes, and since I got onto the Boudica back in Dover at the weekend, we've seen that on the boat too. Men who don't talk about the D-Day experiences, don't even tell their families. One man told me he only told his brother about a month ago. Suddenly, they are sharing experiences and perhaps gaining confidence to talk about stuff which nowadays people would say, well, they have got post-traumatic stress. That didn't happen at the time. Now they are beginning to deal with that and tell the stories, and that helps them gain new strength.
OK, Robert, thank you very much, Robert Hall. Of course,